Orchestrated fresh Western romance narrative, with new character names and emotional arc structure. Orchestrated fresh Western romance narrative, with new character names and emotional arc structure. The words landed in the parlor like a slap nobody saw coming. You'd take the one who mucks the stalls over your own promised girl. Augustus Rourke said it, slow, the way a man says a thing he means to make permanent. Every head in the room turned toward his son. Caleb Rourke stood near the cold hearth with his hat still in his hands, and he had not stepped toward Charlotte Garrity in her butter-yellow silk, the daughter everyone in Cedar Gap had been told to expect. He had stepped toward her sister, toward the tall one in the corner with straw caught in her braid and a smear of axle grease along her wrist. The one most folks in the territory could not have named if you'd offered them $1 to do it. Theodosia Garrity. Tess, to the 3 people who ever bothered to use a name for her, did not move. She waited for the laugh. She waited for Caleb to set his jaw and say he'd misspoken. That of course he meant Lottie. That this was a joke at the expense of the plain sister who'd been left standing by the wood box like a hat rack. That was how these evenings went. Somebody noticed her by accident, somebody corrected the mistake, and she went back to being furniture. But Caleb did not take it back. He looked at her with eyes that had decided something hours ago and were only now letting the rest of the room catch up, and the silence stretched until Tess could hear the lamp wick hissing and her father's breath going ragged in his chest. Cedar Gap sat in a fold of the Wyoming Territory where the wind came down off the Wind River Range in February with a meanness that felt personal. Tess had spent the better part of that day hauling water from the spring to the kitchen, breaking ice on the trough with the flat of an axe, and laying fires in rooms she would not be invited to sit in. Her hands had stopped feeling the cold around noon. She'd learned the trick of that years back. You didn't fight the numbness. You just kept it moving, the way you kept anything moving that had a job to do. The job that evening was Lottie. Charlotte was 19 and lovely in a way that made strangers go quiet, with corn silk hair and a laugh she'd practiced until it sounded careless. Their mother, Esther Garrity, had spent 3 days letting out and taking in the yellow dress. And she'd spent the morning pinning Lottie's hair into something that caught the light. The whole house had been arranged around the visit, the way a stage gets arranged around a play. Augustus Rourke and his son were coming to look the Garrity girls over, and there was only ever one girl meant to be looked at, because the Garrity place was dying. Tess knew it the way she knew the weather, in her joints and her gut before anyone said it out loud. Abner Garrity had run the ranch into a hole digging for a profit the land wouldn't give him, and the spring drought 2 years running had finished what his pride started. There were notes coming due in Cheyenne that her father couldn't cover, and a fence line lawsuit with a neighbor he couldn't win. And behind it all, the slow arithmetic of a man who'd bet everything on weather and lost. The Rourkes, meanwhile, owned half the county outright and leaned on the other half. Their cattle drank from creeks that other men's cattle died beside. When Augustus Rourke wrote to Abner about a marriage, it wasn't courtship. It was a foreclosure with a wedding attached. So Tess had carried the water and laid the fires and stayed in the corner, and she had not minded exactly, because minding cost more than it bought. She'd watched her sister glide forward when their father called Lottie's name, watched the yellow silk whisper across the floorboards Tess had scrubbed at dawn. She'd watched Augustus Rourke's eyes move over Lottie like a buyer at a stock sale, pricing the hocks and the teeth, and she had watched the sun. Caleb Rourke had not looked at Lottie at all. He'd looked at the room, at the worn rug, and the water stains and the mother holding her breath. And then he'd looked at the corner, at Tess, and something had crossed his face that she could not read and did not trust, because trust was another thing that cost more than it bought. Now he'd said her name in front of his father and hers, and the parlor was waiting to see what got broken. "You're mistaken, son." Augustus kept his voice mild, which was worse than shouting. "That's the older one, the hired help, near enough." "She's not hired," Caleb said. "She's the one who built the fire I'm warming my hands by. She's the one who hauled the water in that pitcher." "I've been watching for an hour, sir. Lottie's a fine girl, but I'd be marrying the dress." Abner Garrity made a sound like a man stepping into a creek that's deeper than it looked. "Wyatt." "Pardon, Caleb. You misunderstand the arrangement. Charlotte is the daughter that is, the terms." "I understand the terms." Caleb turned his hat in his hands. "You owe my father money." He sent me to pick a wife to make the debt go away polite. I'm picking. I pick her. Lottie's practiced smile had come apart somewhere in the middle of all this, and what was underneath it surprised Tess. Not relief, not even hurt, but a flash of something close to fury, gone before anyone but a sister would have caught it. Esther Garrity had gone white to the lips, and Abner looked at Tess for the first time that whole evening. Really looked, the way a man looks at a tool he forgot he owned and is startled to find still useful. Tess can't, he started. Tess can speak for herself, Tess said. It came out of her without permission, in a voice she barely recognized, and the room went still all over again. She had not meant to say anything. She had meant to let the men finish trading her and then go bank the fires and lie awake, doing sums. But she'd heard her father say Tess can't, the way he'd said it her whole life. Can't be presentable, can't be helped, can't be anything but what she already was. And something in her that had been packed down hard for 26 years shifted like settling ice. Caleb looked at her, not at her father. At her. Will you talk to me? He asked. Outside. Just talk. You can say no to the whole business, and I'll ride out and tell my father I'd changed my mind. She should have said no. A sensible woman, a woman with anywhere else to go, would have said no. But Tess Garrity had spent her life being the thing decisions happened to, and here was a man offering her, of all the strange things, a question. I'll get my coat, she said. They walked out past the corral where the horses stood steaming in the cold, and Caleb didn't fill the silence the way nervous men do. He let it sit. When he finally spoke, it wasn't sweet talk. I'm not a good catch, he said. I want you to know that going in. My father's ranch is the biggest thing in 3 counties, and I'd give a great deal not to inherit it. There's things about how it got that big I can't make peace with. If you marry me, you're not marrying into ease. You're marrying into a fight I haven't figured out how to have yet. Tess pulled her coat tighter. Why me then? You could have said no to the whole thing without the trouble of me. Because you didn't perform, he said. Everybody in that room was selling me something. The dress, the smile, the debt dressed up as a daughter. You were just standing there being real. I'm so tired I can't tell you of people selling me things. He looked at her sideways. And you've got grease on your wrist, and you didn't try to hide it. I'd rather have a wife who knows how to fix a wagon than one who's never touched a wheel. It was not a declaration of love. Tess was glad of that. A declaration of love she wouldn't have believed. This she could turn over in her hands and weigh, and it weighed true. My father will gut you on the terms, she said. My father already has him gutted, Caleb said. That's the part neither of them wants you to see. She married him 11 days later in a small hard ceremony in the Cedar Gap church with frost on the inside of the windows. Lottie did not come. Esther came and cried, though Tess could not have said whether it was grief or relief, or simply the habit of a woman who'd learned to cry where it would be noticed. Abner came and shook Caleb's hand like a man closing a sale, and Tess understood, watching her father's face, that she had just paid his debt with her body the same as if she'd been sold off a block, and that he was pleased, and that he would never once think to feel ashamed. That was the thing she carried out of the church and up the road to the Rourke place. Not love. Not even hope yet, just the cold, clarifying knowledge that her own father had spent her like a coin and slept fine afterward, and that whatever she built now, she would build out of the wreckage of being worth less to her family than a pasture. The Rourke ranch was a kingdom. Tess had not understood from the valley floor how big a thing it was until she lived inside it. Thousands of acres rolling up into the foothills, 4 bunkhouses, a barn bigger than the Cedar Gap church, and a main house with more rooms than the family could use. There were ranch hands who'd worked there their whole lives and didn't know each other's names. There was a cook and 2 girls under her, and a man whose only job was the horses. And over all of it, like weather, hung Augustus Rourke. He was civil to Tess in the way Frost is civil. He'd lost the argument with his son, and he was a man who lost arguments rarely and forgave them never. At supper he'd ask her questions, designed to find the edges of her ignorance, about silver prices, about the territorial legislature, about families she'd never been allowed near, and watch her not know, and let the silence do his work. Tess learned to answer the questions she could and meet the ones she couldn't with a flat steadiness that gave him nothing to push against. She'd had practice at being given nothing. She found she could give nothing right back. It was Caleb's mother who undid the whole arrangement, and she'd been dead 4 years by then. Tess found the first piece of it by accident. The way she found most true things. While she was working, she'd taken on the running of the main house because nobody else wanted it, and because idle hands made her want to climb the walls. And in the course of that, she went up into the attic after a leak and found, behind a water-warped trunk, a smaller box that had been deliberately hidden. Inside were letters in a woman's hand and a survey map, in a ledger that did not match the ledger Augustus kept in his study. The woman's hand belonged to Cordelia Rourke, Augustus's wife, Caleb's mother. She had died, Tess had been told, when her horse spooked on the river trail and went down a bank, a grief the household did not discuss, a name that made Augustus leave a room. Tess had taken the silence for a husband's mourning. Reading the letters by the attic's one cold window, she understood it for something else. Cordelia had found out where the kingdom came from. The bottomland, the part of the Rourke holdings that held the only reliable spring for 10 miles. The land that made the rest of it worth having. That land had belonged to a homesteading family named Tatum. The Tatums had proved up their claim honest and filed it in Cheyenne. And then there had been a fire in the Territorial Land Office. And when the dust settled, the deed on record bore a different name and an earlier date. And the Tatum family had been turned off the only good water in the county with the law's blessing and a marshal's escort. Cordelia's letters laid it out in a clean, furious hand. The forged filing date. The clerk who'd been paid. The Tatum father who died of a winter on bad ground a man his age should have survived. The Tatum children scattered to relatives in 3 states. And Cordelia's own slow, horrified arithmetic as she added up the husband she'd married and found him short. The last letter was dated 4 days before she died. It was addressed to a circuit judge in Cheyenne. She'd written that she meant to bring him the ledger and the survey, and tell the truth in open court, that she could not eat her supper one more night off stolen ground, that she was afraid of her husband and going anyway. She'd never reached Cheyenne. Her horse had spooked on the river trail. Tess sat in the cold attic a long time with the letters in her lap. Then she put everything back exactly as she'd found it, swept the dust to hide her knees marks, and went downstairs and laid the supper fire with hands that did not shake, because she had learned long ago to keep the shaking on the inside where it couldn't be used against her. She told Caleb that night in their room with the lamp turned low. He didn't speak for a long while. When he did, his voice had gone to gravel. I always knew it was something. I didn't know it was that. I didn't know she died trying to stop it. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He told me grief made her careless. He let me grow up thinking my mother died of bad luck on a horse she'd ridden 1,000 times. What do you want to do? Tess asked. It was, she realized, the same gift he'd given her in the cold by the corral. A question. The room could break in a lot of directions, and she would not be the one to choose it for him. I want to finish what she started, Caleb said, and I am sick with knowing what it cost her to start it. They might have done it quietly. Tess thought about that later, how close they came to keeping the secret a season longer, gathering proof, finding the judge, doing it slow and safe. What forced their hand was Abner Garrity. Her father came to the Rourke ranch in May, hat in hand, because his notes had come due and his lawsuit had gone against him, and the marriage that was supposed to save him had only delayed the drowning. He'd come to ask Augustus for more time, more money, the kind of mercy he had never once shown anyone under his own roof. And Augustus, who collected leverage the way other men collected debts owed to them, had named his price. Tess heard it from the hall. She brought coffee, the wife's errand, and stopped outside the study door because her own name had come through it. Your girl's settled in well enough, Augustus was saying. But there's the matter of the younger one, Charlotte. My son made a sentimental choice. The territory talks. A second tie between our families. A quieter arrangement, you understand, would smooth a great deal. Charlotte's of an age. I've a nephew and Laramie who'd suit. You'd find your notes considerably easier to carry. Tess understood it whole in an instant. The way you understand a snake on the path before you've consciously seen it. Her father had sold her to clear his debts. Now Augustus was offering to clear the rest by buying Lottie too, folding the second daughter into the empire to keep the first quiet and the Garrity ranch in line. And from the sound of her father's silence, he was considering it. She did not bring the coffee in. She went and found Lottie. Her sister was in Cedar Gap still, in the dying house. And when Tess rode in unannounced, Lottie met her in the yard with her arms crossed and 4 years of resentment in her stance, because Lottie had grown up the chosen one and been left, on the one night it mattered, standing in a yellow dress while the plain sister got carried off to a kingdom. Come to gloat? Lottie said. Come to warn you, Tess said. Father's about to sell you to a Rourke nephew in Laramie to clear his notes. Augustus offered it this afternoon. Father didn't say no. Tess watched it land. Watched the chosen one understand. Maybe for the first time, that being chosen and being sold were the same transaction, wearing different clothes, and that the only difference between the sisters had ever been which of them the buyers preferred. He wouldn't, Lottie said. But her voice didn't believe it. He did it to me with a wedding and called it good fortune, Tess said. You were never his daughter, Lottie. You were his best dress. He kept you fine because a fine thing sells better. I'd found that out the hard way, and I'm not going to let you find it out in Laramie, married to a man you've never met. It was a cruel thing to say, and it was a true thing, and Tess had learned the two were not opposites. Lottie's face went through its whole stock of practiced expressions, looking for one that fit and not finding it. And then, underneath all of them, the real one came up. The fury Tess had glimpsed for half a second 4 years ago in the parlor. The fury of a girl who'd been told her whole worth was her face and had half believed it. I'm done being his finest possession, Lottie said. Then come with me, Tess said. Because what I'm about to do is going to break a great deal, and you'll want to be standing on the right side of it when it goes. They rode back to the Rourke ranch together, and Tess told her sister the truth on the road. About Cordelia, about the Tatooms, about the spring and the forge deed and the woman who died on the river trail, trying to put it right. By the time they came up the long drive, Lottie's chin was set in a way Tess had never seen on her, and Tess thought, watching her, that she'd spent her whole life believing her sister was the soft one, and had been wrong about that too. The thing came to a head at supper, and it came because Augustus Rourke could not resist a victory. He had Abner there at the table, settling the second sale of a roast and good wine, talking past Tess and Lottie as if their futures were whether to be discussed and not endured. He was expansive, almost warm, the way a man is warm when he believes he's won, and Caleb sat across from his father with the ledger and the survey and the bundle of his mother's letters and a saddlebag under his chair, because he and Tess had agreed that morning that whatever came, they were done eating off stolen ground. There's a thing the family ought to settle, Caleb said into a lull, before any new arrangements get made. Augustus smiled the smile of a man who thinks he knows what's coming. Speak your piece, son. Caleb set the survey map on the table among the dishes. He set the false ledger and the true one side by side. He set the letters down last, and he kept his hand on them. This is the original Tatum claim, he said, steady though Tess could see what it cost him. Filed honest. Proved up honest. This is the filing that's on record now. The date's been forged. There's a clerk in Cheyenne who took money for it, and I expect for the right offer he'll say so. He moved his hand off the letters. And these are Mother's. She found all this 4 years ago. She was riding to Cheyenne to give it to a judge when her horse went down the riverbank, 4 days after she rode the last one. You told me grief made her careless. The room had gone to stone. Abner's fork hung in the air. Lottie's eyes were fixed on Augustus's face. Esther was not there to see it, and Tess found herself fiercely glad of that her mother at least was spared this particular table. Augustus did not flinch. That was the part Tess never forgot, that he didn't flinch. He looked at the proof of the worst thing he'd ever done laid out among the gravy boats, and he simply began smoothly to threaten. You'll burn that, he said, or you'll find out what it is to be a Rourke with no Rourke money. I made this ranch out of nothing. The Tatooms were squatters who'd have lost that ground to the bank inside 2 years. I took what would have been wasted, and I built something that feeds 200 men. Your mother was a sentimental woman who didn't understand what it takes to build a thing that lasts. He turned the smile, now, on Tess. And you grease-handed nobody, you've put ideas in his head. I should have drowned this notion in the cradle. You drowned its mother, Tess said. She said it quietly, and it carried to every corner of the room. You sat at this table for 4 years and let your son believe his mama died of bad luck, and you ate off the Tatooms' water every single night. and you were going to buy my sister the way my father bought me, to keep it all quiet. She stood. She had spent her whole life sitting in corners, and she found she could not do it one more minute. I know exactly what you are, Augustus Rourke, because I was raised by a smaller, poorer version of you. She did not look at her father when she said it, but she felt him flinch, and she did not soften it. Men who decide what people are worth and then spin them. I'm done being spent. So's Lottie. So's your son. And so are the Tatums the minute that Judge reads these letters. You'll have nothing, Augustus said. I'll cut him off. I'll cut you both off. You'll be back hauling water before the snow flies. I've been hauling water my whole life, Tess said. I'm good at it. I'd rather haul honest water than drink stolen wine at your table till I die. It was Abner who broke, in the end, and not the way Tess expected. Her father had sat through the whole reckoning gone gray in the face. And now he pushed back from the table and stood, and for a moment Tess braced for him to side with Augustus, to choose the money one last time, because that was the only choice she'd ever known him to make. I won't sell Charlotte, Abner said. His voice shook. God forgive me. I sold one daughter and called it her good fortune, and I'd have sold the other one tonight if you hadn't. He stopped. He looked at Tess, and there was something in his face she'd waited 26 years to see and had stopped expecting. I don't know how to be a different man. I'm too old, and I've done it too long. But I won't sit at this table and help him buy another one of my girls. I'll lose the ranch first. I should have lost it a long time ago. It was not enough. Tess knew, even as it cracked something open in her chest, that it was years too late and a fraction too small, that a man didn't get absolved of a sold daughter by declining to sell the second one, but it was the first true thing her father had ever said in her hearing, and she let it be what it was. They took it all to Cheyenne. Caleb rode with the letters and the ledgers, and Tess rode beside him. And Lottie came too, because she said she wasn't going back to wait in a yellow dress for the next man to decide her. The circuit judge Cordelia had meant to reach was still on the bench. He read the letters of a dead woman who'd been afraid of her husband and gone anyway, and he was quiet a long time, and then he opened an inquiry that took the better part of a year and shook the territory like a thunderclap. The clerk in Cheyenne confessed for a lighter sentence. The forged filing was struck. What was left of the Tatum family? 2 grown children and a clutch of grandchildren scattered across Nebraska and Kansas was found and notified, and the spring land was theirs again in law, if not in fact, because the fact of it had a town and 200 cattle and 40 years sitting on top of it. Augustus Rourke fought it the way he fought everything, with lawyers and money and the long memory of every favor he was owed. But the thing about a man who builds his whole life on a foundation of theft is that the foundation, once cracked, takes the house with it. He lost the bottom land. He lost the lawsuit and then the appeal. He lost the territorial connections that had been built on the assumption he could not be touched. He did not lose everything. Men like that rarely do. But he lost the empire's keystone, and he lost his son, who packed 2 horses and a marriage and left the big house for good, and he lost the version of his own story in which he was a builder and not a thief. He died 3 years later in a much smaller house with a great deal of money and not one person who'd sit with him. And Tess, when the news came, found she felt nothing she could name, which was its own kind of answer. Caleb and Tess didn't take the empire. They couldn't have, and didn't want to. What they took was a parcel up in the foothills that Augustus had never bothered with because it was too rough to graze easy. And they took it honest, every acre paid for, and they made the Tatum's grown daughter a partner in the water that ran through both their places, drawn up in a deed that named the truth of where it came from. It was a smaller life than the one in the big house. There were winters it nearly broke them, but it was theirs, and every fence on it marked a line they'd honestly drawn, and every hand who worked it got a fair wage, and his own name remembered. Esther came to live with them after Abner finally did lose the Cedar Gap Ranch, as everyone had always known he would. She was a quieter woman away from her husband, and Tess watched her mother slowly become someone who'd been buried for 30 years under the work of keeping up appearances. They didn't speak of the old days much. But one evening, Esther took Tess's grease-stained hand in both of hers and said, "I should have seen you. All those years, I looked right at you and I didn't see you. And that's the worst thing I ever did, worse than anything your father managed. And Tess held her mother's hands and let her say it. Because some debts can't be paid, only acknowledged. Abner lived out his years in a cottage on their land, useful in small ways, never quite able to look his eldest daughter in the eye, and Tess let that be what it was, too. She'd stopped needing him to be more than he was. That, she came to understand, was the freedom, not forgiveness, exactly, but the laying down of the wish that he'd been a different father. Lottie did not marry the Laramie nephew or anyone else for a long while. She took the schoolhouse in the foothill town that grew up near the ranch, and she turned out to have a hard, practical mind under all that corn silk hair. And she ran the school, and then the school board, and then, when the territory became a state, she was one of the first women in the county to stand for office and win it. The chosen sister and the corner sister, it turned out, had both been waiting their whole lives for somebody to ask them a question, instead of telling them what they were worth. Tess thought about that often, about how close they'd both come to never being asked. Caleb and Tess had a daughter first, and they named her Cordelia, after a woman who died on a river trail trying to do the right thing. And they called her Cora, and Tess told her, when she was old enough, the whole story. The forged deed. The dead grandmother she was named for, the great-grandfather who sold daughters, and the grandfather who built a kingdom on a fire in a land office. She told it honest, all of it, the shameful parts included, because she'd decided the day she stood up from that supper table, that her children would not grow up eating off comfortable lies. They had a son after, 2 years on, a boy who came into the world bellowing and never quite stopped, and they named him Plain and let him grow up rough and happy in a way Tess herself never had. She'd watched the two of them tear across the yard, Cora bossing her little brother through some game of her own invention, and feel a thing she had no word for, that was part disbelief and part fierce gratitude and part the ache of the girl she'd been, the one who hauled water in the cold and was sure she'd never matter to a living soul. On a clear evening when Cora was 6, Caleb found Tess up on the ridge that overlooked their land, where the spring caught the last of the light and ran clean down toward the Tatum's place and theirs. He had the boy on his shoulders and Cora by the hand. "Any regrets?" he asked. He asked her that sometimes, and it was always a real question, which was the thing about him she'd never stopped being grateful for. Tess looked out over the rough, small, honest kingdom they'd made out of the wreckage of 2 proud men's lies. She thought about the corner she'd stood in, and the question he'd asked her in the cold, and the supper table where she'd finally stood up. "I spent my whole life being chosen for or against by somebody else," she said. "And I married a man who handed me back the choosing. No, I've got no regrets. I'm right where I picked to be." The sun went down red over the Wind River Range, and the spring ran on, and Cora tugged her mother's hand and said, the way children always do, "Tell it again, about how you and Papa met." And Tess smiled and told it one more time. The whole of it. The shame and the courage both. Because it was a true story, and the true ones were the only kind she meant to leave her children. It started, she always said, with a man who looked past every pretty thing in a room and chose the girl on the corner with grease on her hands. But that wasn't really where it started, and Cora was getting old enough to hear the rest. It started the night that girl, for the first time in her life, opened her mouth and said she'd speak for herself. I keep coming back to the moment Tess Garrity opened her mouth in that cold parlor and said she'd speak for herself. For 26 years, she had been the furniture in her own house, hauling water in the dark and laying fires in rooms she was never invited to sit in. And nothing in her life moved until she decided to stop waiting for permission. People who hear this story think Caleb rescued her. He didn't. He handed her a question instead of a price tag, and she did the rescuing herself. The longer I sit with how it all came apart, the more I'm convinced nothing in it happened by luck. Augustus Rourke didn't lose his empire because fortune finally turned on him. He lost it because he'd built the whole thing on a stolen spring and a forged filing date, and a foundation like that holds right up until the day it doesn't. Cordelia saw the rot 4 years before anyone, and she paid for seeing it with her life. But even her death didn't go to waste, because the truth she gathered sat in that attic waiting for someone brave enough to finish the ride to Cheyenne. You plant a lie, and you harvest a collapse. You plant the truth, quietly, even scared half to death, and one day it comes up through the floor of a man's own supper table. What stays with me is that Tess didn't come out on top because she was the prettiest or the luckiest in that room. She came out on top because she would not spend another human being the way her father spent her. And that refusal, that stubborn, bone-deep sense of what's owed to a person, is the thing I most want to grow in myself. Burning those letters and keeping the big house would have been easier every single day. Doing right almost never is. But a good heart alone would have gotten her run over. Tess had to be clear-eyed, too. She read the false ledger, she heard Augustus offer to buy Lottie, she understood the trap before it shut, and she got to her sister in time. Decency without a sharp mind just hands you to the smarter, colder people. You have to be able to see the whole board. And then she had to outlast it. The court fight took a year. There were winters on that rough little parcel that nearly broke her and Caleb both. None of it would have mattered if she'd quit in the third month. And that's what I keep reminding myself, that real grit isn't one brave night in a parlor. It's holding on to a hard, true thing long after the heat that started it is burned off. So when I picture Tess and Caleb up on that ridge, with Cora and her little brother, on land they paid for honest, I don't see a fairy tale. I see a woman who chose right, thought clear, and held on.